Nombra una guerra peleado por los Estados Unidos en los años 1900. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1900s. Primera Guerra Mundial. World War I. World War I. Segunda Guerra Mundial. World War II. World War II. Guerra de Corea. Korean War. Korean War. Guerra de Vietnam. Vietnam War. Vietnam War. Guerra del Golfo Pérsico. Persian Gulf War.
¿Quién era presidente durante la Primera Guerra Mundial?
Who was president during World War I?
Woodrow Wilson.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to coverage of the 1912 presidential election. It has been an interesting election year. Now it's November 5th, Election Day, and the votes are coming in. But first, let's recap some of the drama leading up to this point. Theodore Roosevelt, former President of the United States, actually won most of the Republican primaries, even in President William Howard Taft's home state of Ohio. Despite Roosevelt's popular support, he was not able to overcome the power of Taft's supporters within the Republican Party. A group of Republicans refusing to support Taft's nomination at the Republican National Convention formed the Progressive Party and named Theodore Roosevelt as their candidate for president. Last month, Roosevelt was shot at close range before he was to deliver a campaign speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The gunman failed to kill the former president because the force of the bullet was reduced by an eyeglasses case and a speech manuscript in the breast pocket of Roosevelt's overcoat. With the bullet still in his body, he told the crowd, "You see, it takes more than one bullet to kill a bull moose." Only after his speech was over did he go to the hospital. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the Progressive Party has become known as the Bull Moose Party. President Taft has also had a tough go of it as of late. Progressives within the Republican Party have opposed his conservative policies. To make matters worse, just last week, James Sherman, his vice president and running mate, passed away from a lengthy illness affecting his kidneys. Now, folks, we are down to the wire. We have 4 candidates vying for the presidency. Let's take a closer look at these contenders and highlight some of their views. First up is the incumbent Republican William Howard Taft. Taft has a solid antitrust record, using 90 lawsuits against the trust during his time as president. Taft supports high import tariffs, limitations on child and female labor, and workers' compensation laws. He is against initiative, referendum, and recall. Taft has promoted the idea that judges need to be more powerful than those elected to office. Taft is determined to preserve the conservative heart of the Republican Party. He has campaigned quietly. Some say it's because he knows he has a slim chance of winning now that the traditional Republican support has been split between the conservative Republican Party and the Progressive Party. Challenging Taft for the presidency is Democrat Woodrow Wilson, hailing from South Carolina. Wilson was president of Princeton University and later developed a strong reform record as the governor of New Jersey. His platform consists of his new freedom. Wilson wants to implement antitrust legislation to eliminate monopolies, viewing big business as unfair and inefficient. Wilson feels that big business reduces opportunity for many ordinary Americans. He seeks an era of small government, small businesses, and free competition. Wilson is also critical of organized labor, socialism, and radical farmers. Wilson supports progressive legislation including tariff reduction, income tax reform, currency, and credit reform. Also throwing his hat in the ring is the socialist Eugene V. Debs. Debs was a labor organizer and one of the most prominent socialists in the United States. Some members of the Socialist Party propose ending America's capitalist economic system and replacing it with a socialized economic system. Debs advocates for public ownership of the railroads and utilities, no tariffs, a shortened workday, a minimum wage, a graduated income tax, and a system of social insurance against unemployment and industrial accidents and death. Socialists also advocate for the election of the president and vice president by direct vote of the people. He maintains that the other political parties are financed by the large trusts. Unfortunately for Debs, most of the labor unions are supporting Wilson. And last but not least, the former president and progressive bull moose candidate, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt's platform formed around his new nationalism principles, which include a broad range of social and political reforms, including a federal child labor law, federal workmen's compensation, regulation of labor relations, and a minimum wage for women. The Progressive Party also advocates lower tariffs, initiative, referendum, recall, direct election of senators, and direct primaries. Roosevelt differentiates between good and bad trusts and claimed that the big business must be strictly regulated in the public interest. He believes in the protection of workers and consumers and in environmental protection. The Progressive Party is the only party to advocate women's suffrage or the right to vote at the national level. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is time. The votes are in. Wilson and the Democrats have won with 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt and the Progressive Bull Moose Party came in second with 88 electoral votes, while Taft and the Republican Party came in third with 8 electoral votes. Debs did not score any electoral votes, but he did manage to earn 6% of the popular vote, the highest proportion ever for the Socialist Party. It is also quite clear that the split in the Republican Party has contributed to the Democrats' victory. The 1912 election was significant for several reasons. It was the high point of the progressive movement in terms of progressive ideals and rhetoric at the national level. In this election, a third-party candidate, Roosevelt of the Progressive Party, beat one of the two major party candidates, Taft of the Republican Party. Wilson's victory brought the Democrats back in power of the national government for the first time since before the Civil War.
President, I'm Hoover, the chief usher. How do you do, Hoover?
The Democrats gained both houses of Congress as well as the presidency. The election also brought Southern leadership and influence to the national government. In fact, 5 of Wilson's 10 cabinet members were born in the South. William Jennings Bryan was made Secretary of State, and many congressional committees were chaired by Southern legislators. Let's now take a look at some of Woodrow Wilson's key accomplishments as president. While initially differing from Theodore Roosevelt on the direction of progressivism, Wilson later advocated many of his ideas. He supported measures that expanded the role of the national government in regulating the economy. He confronted what he referred to as the triple wall of privilege, the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. Through Wilson's skillful leadership, the Underwood Tariff of 1913 lowered the tax on imported goods from 40% to 25%. The decreased tariff was passed by Congress in an effort to lessen the power of large trusts, promote competition, and open American markets to foreign products. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created a publicly controlled banking system resistant to financial panic. 12 regional district reserve banks were created. Each bank was independent, but they were regulated by the Federal Reserve Board, who oversaw national fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve issues paper money and controls the amount of money in circulation through money reserves and interest rates. The new Federal Reserve System provided a reliable, flexible currency system with a decentralized money supply. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 identified specific illegal practices and business combinations that were against the law if they tended to lessen competition or create a monopoly. The act also exempted farm cooperatives and legitimate labor union activities, such as picketing, strikes, and boycotts, from antitrust prosecution. The Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 provided regulatory oversight of big business by establishing the Federal Trade Commission to enforce the Clayton Antitrust Act and to issue cease and desist orders to stop unfair business practices. American workers also benefited from a series of laws supported by Wilson in 1915 and 1916. These included a federal workmen's compensation law, a federal child labor law, the Adamson 8-hour law for railroad workers, and the Seamen's Act, which granted sailors the same rights held by other workers. Wilson also approved the Federal Farm Loan Act, which offered low-interest loans to farmers.
¿Cuántas enmiendas tiene la Constitución?
How many amendments does the Constitution have?
$27.
27.
4 constitutional amendments were passed during Wilson's 2 terms in office. The 16th Amendment allowed Congress to collect a graduated income tax.
¿Cuándo es el último día que se puede enviar la Declaración Federal de Impuestos sobre el Ingreso? When is the last day you can send in federal income tax forms? El 15 de abril. April 15th.
The 17th Amendment allowed voters to directly elect U.S. senators.
Nosotros elegimos a un senador de los Estados Unidos por cuántos años. We elect a U.S. senator for how many years?
6.
6.
6.
The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States.
During World War I, the movement to outlaw alcohol in the U.S., or Prohibition movement, finally achieved success with the adoption of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. The roots of Prohibition movement can be traced back as far as the colonial period in American history, but in a country notorious for its consumption of alcohol, little ground was gained passing any national law banning drink. However, around the start of the 20th century, leading temperance organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League converted their efforts from changing individuals to campaigning for the legal prohibition of alcohol. Supporters of this measure drew on the moral theme of the day, that was, alcohol was destroying the moral compass of America and making citizens less productive and destroying American families. In addition, those in favor of a national prohibition highlighted current medical and scientific findings showing that alcohol did more harm than good. In fact, by the 1910s, the Anti-Saloon League had become one of the most effective pressure groups in American history, staging protests and mobilizing Protestant churches behind a single-minded effort to elect dry political candidates. In fact, the National Prohibition Act, known as the Volstead Act, was put forward by the Anti-Saloon League. The leader of the league, Wayne Wheeler, drafted the bill and named it for Andrew Volstead, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee who helped oversee the legislation. Even in the years leading up to the passing of the act, several states had outlawed alcohol, and debate about a national law was gaining momentum. Wets, or those who were opposed to the law, battled in Congress with Dries, who favored the federal legislation outlawing all liquor in the U.S. In fact, by 1916, both houses of Congress possessed a 2/3 majority support for prohibition. Those in favor of the law drew on small-town citizens and women reformers, as well as prominent business leaders like J.D. Rockefeller. President Howard Taft had vetoed an earlier law to make the shipping of alcohol across state lines illegal, but after the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912, the concept of national prohibition became invigorated. As America entered World War I, the concept of prohibition started to make sense to many. It was seen as a way to protect the family, promote social stability, and check big business. The war actually gave the movement some validity. Grain was so crucial to the war effort, how could the government allow it to be used to make liquor? Others argued that alcohol, like brothels, undermined the discipline of young soldiers. On December 18, 1917, Congress passed and sent to the states the 18th Amendment. 1 year after the ratification, in January 1919, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicants in the U.S. was banned. The federal government now had the authority to pass enforcement laws. President Wilson vetoed the Volstead Act, which further defined intoxicants, but Congress overturned his veto. The law stood. The Volstead Act defined intoxicants as all beverages with 0.5% alcohol. The 18th Amendment went into effect on January 16, 1920, with the Department of Treasury bearing the responsibility to enforce the laws of the new amendment. America was now dry. In a way, the passage of the 18th Amendment was a victory for the rural and small towns of America over the big cities, where immoral behavior seemed rampant. To many nativist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, the amendment was a victory of evangelical Protestantism over Roman Catholicism. The issue divided Americans sharply along religious, ethnic, and geographic lines. Supporters of Prohibition usually lived south of the Mason-Dixon line and west of the Mississippi. Those opposed to Prohibition were usually single, from a specific ethnic group, and living in a metropolitan area. For supporters of the Act, the passage was their millennium. It was the dawning of a new age when morality in America would be elevated with productivity. Most did not anticipate the strong resistance to the law and amendment. Not long after the 18th Amendment had been in place, authorities found a still with a daily capacity of 130 gallons near Austin, Texas, on a farm belonging to Morris Shepherd, the quote, father of the national prohibition movement. The utopian vision of many was, as we know, not to be. The Treasury Department had limited resources for enforcement. In Detroit, the liquor industry during the Prohibition era was second in size only to the auto industry. As we know, the amendment did not stop people from drinking. Speakeasies, hip flasks, and cocktail parties were among the social invitations of the Prohibition era, along with increased drinking by women, and enterprising criminals became American heroes.
This amendment was later repealed or canceled by the 21st Amendment. And finally, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote.
In the 21st century, there is not much women cannot achieve when compared to male counterparts. For instance, women can obtain an education, work in a career of their choice, and exercise the right to vote. However, for many years, women did not enjoy the same basic rights as men in the United States. Many historians point to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as the start of the women's suffrage movement. Early feminist leaders brought attention to women's rights by calling for improved legal status, economic opportunity, and the right to vote. Another early women's rights leader who challenged existing social norms and inequalities between the sexes was Susan B. Anthony. Anthony and Stanton first proposed a national women's suffrage amendment granting women the right to vote in 1878. Lucy Stone worked at the state level using a state-by-state approach to achieve voting rights for women, but it was not until 1920 when the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, and National Woman's Party, NWP, finally secured the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women the right to vote. It's important to note the amendment, in fact, banned laws which restricted voting to men. This is a critical distinction because women of color continued to face widespread systemic barriers to voting well into the 1960s. So how did all this change come about? Women had to tackle long-held beliefs about proper roles for their gender. Historically speaking, men and women were seen to have separate spheres of influence. Men's roles were predominantly as the head of the household and outside the home. Middle-class women's roles were almost exclusively within the home and focused on the family. Women who worked outside of the home were usually young, unmarried, and employed as domestic help or as factory workers. Some educated women worked as teachers, nurses, and librarians. During the Progressive Era, women's clubs helped expand middle-class women's roles outside of the home. Initially concentrated on education and literacy, women's clubs began working to alleviate social problems. Women were key players in the push for prohibition, meaning outlawing the sale and consumption of alcohol, improving housing standards, regulations of the food and drug industry, and government inspections of factories. The settlement house movement provided assistance to immigrant communities and led to the rise of social work. Women's organizations supported laws regarding women and children, such as public assistance for mothers with dependent children and a minimum wage law for women and children. Some middle-class women joined laborers to push for laws protecting workers. Women joined labor unions, held meetings, picketed, and raised money to support their causes. Women's activism during the Progressive Era was a way many women began to enter public life. The idea of separate spheres for men and women was challenged as women became more involved in civic matters. As women began to address social issues, it seemed natural to many women that they should be able to vote. Some women's suffrage supporters stressed that if women were granted the right to vote, they would bring a sort of moral uplift to the country. For example, they argued that women would likely vote for prohibition or laws aimed at stopping prostitution. By the turn of the century, only 4 Western states allowed women full suffrage. So why exactly did women's suffrage take so long to achieve? As with many controversial political issues, there was substantial opposition. Anti-suffrage organizations, newspapers, and petitions were formed to stop women's suffrage gains. Some upper-class women opposed the women's suffrage movement, arguing that women were encroaching on men's territory. The anti-suffrage movement contended that granting women the right to vote was challenging the natural order of society, and they attempted to associate women's suffrage with compromised morals, even leading to neglect of children and divorce. The most significant resistance to women's suffrage came from the South and East. In 1900, Susan B. Anthony retired from the leadership of NAWSA, and Carrie Chapman Catt became the organization's new president. A skilled political organizer, Catt called for organization at the local levels while retaining firm national control. NAWSA worked steadily to gain women's suffrage state by state, and slowly but surely additional states joined the women's suffrage ranks. The suffragists used modern publicity tactics such as newspaper advertisements, parades, banners, posters, catchy slogans, and playing cards promoting the suffrage agenda. In 1913, thousands of women marched in a national women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. on the day before President Wilson's inauguration. These efforts by suffragists created hype around the movement. Speaking of hype, let's talk about the more militant side of the women's suffrage movement. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns had spent time in Britain observing the women's suffrage movement and brought back to the States some of the militant tactics used over there. Upon their return, the women served on NAWSA's congressional committee, whose main purpose was to lobby Congress for national suffrage amendment. Paul and Burns went on to form the National Woman's Party, NWP. The NWP was more confrontational than NAWSA. Some of these tactics used by Paul and her followers included aggressive lobbying of government officials, civil disobedience, picketing the White House during wartime, demonstrations, and even hunger strikes. Many members of the NWP were arrested and imprisoned. Some were even force-fed to end hunger strikes. While not all of these tactics may seem extreme today, these activities were shocking and brought increased attention to the women's suffrage movement. Although this contributed to the long-term development of gender equality in the United States, it's important to analyze the efforts with a critical lens. The women's suffrage movement and its leading organizations were predominantly composed of white middle and upper-class women. Many leading white women in the suffrage movement advocated against granting black men the vote before it had been extended to white women. After the 15th Amendment did grant the vote to black men, many in the women's suffrage movement leveraged the idea that extending the vote to white women would act as a counterbalance to the votes of black men. The movement accepted the expediency of generating support among conservative men, and in particular politicians from the South who had opposed the expansion of voting rights to black American men. Within the political maneuvering, the default assumption was that granting women the right to vote would, in fact, be largely an exercise in extending the vote to white women. President Woodrow Wilson had dodged supporting a federal women's suffrage amendment for several years. He endorsed women's suffrage initiatives at the state level in the 1916 presidential Democratic platform. In that same year, Jeanette Rankin from Montana was the first woman to be elected to Congress. It was not until 1918 that President Wilson finally supported the 19th Amendment, partly due to women's contributions during World War I. Decades after the women's suffrage amendment was first proposed, the U.S. Senate adopted the 19th Amendment by a close vote on June 4, 1919. It took 14 months for the states to ratify the amendment, meaning to approve by vote, which happened on August 18, 1920. The 19th Amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The 19th Amendment granting nationwide women's suffrage was nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in her honor. Although a victory for many women in America, women of color were largely left out, and especially so in the South. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright intimidation continued to prevent them from exercising the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was not so much a victory, and instead it constitutes an extension of the racial discrimination already faced by black men to now include women as well. This is why it is crucial to note the 19th Amendment did not explicitly grant all women the right to vote, so much as it made discrimination based only on sex illegal. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, Alice Paul went on to write the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. She believed that the 19th Amendment would never truly protect women's rights and prevent discrimination based on sex. The ERA became known as the Alice Paul Amendment and was a part of the 1923 National Women's Party platform. Other former suffrage leaders did not support the ERA because they thought its demands went too far and could potentially damage previous gains for women in terms of labor legislation. Congress eventually adopted the ERA in 1972, but the states failed to ratify it.
Implement it. Democratic President Woodrow Wilson knew the national government had defeated the old slave plantation, so he and other progressives wanted a new plantation system ruled by the national government, so it would last forever. Wilson's first step? Federal segregation. He forced his departments to establish separate workstations and restrooms for blacks. Wilson's second step? Racial terrorism. Wilson screened the film Birth of a Nation in the White House. It spurred a national revival of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had previously been confined to a handful of southern states. Now it stretched from coast to coast. The Klan became the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party. Wilson was the first progressive president. Progressive here means progress toward the powerful centralized state and away from the American founding. In the Democrats' new plantation scheme, the big house is the White House, and the plantation master is the president.
Honeymoon, honeymoon, keep the shining in June. Your silvery beams will bring long dreams. We'll be cuddling soon. Someday soon, my silvery moon.
Are you ill?
I don't know. I'm all right.
Come and sit down.
In their favor. Until now, President Woodrow Wilson has kept America out of the war.
Wilson recognized that the American people did not want to get involved in a war, particularly if it's a war far away involving people and for causes that we had nothing to do with. Frankly, the American people did not see themselves at immediate risk.
But with hostilities escalating, a peaceful solution seems less and less likely. And Wilson's advisors urge him to begin preparing military forces. Among them is the 35-year-old Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Mr. President, I recommend an immediate allocation of more funds to our naval resources if we want to maintain military preparedness.
Wilson found himself being drawn closer and closer to war. In the spring of 1915, the British liner the Lusitania was sunk, and on board were over 100 Americans. Now, this was a big deal. Until this time, it had been a European war, but now in this European war, Americans were getting killed.
American resentment grows against Germany. And on February 26, 1917, it finally reaches a boiling point.
Mr. President, I think you should look at this right away.
Great Britain intercepts a secret telegram from Germany, intended for the Mexican government, containing a shocking proposal.
Nombra un estado que tiene frontera con México. Name one state that borders Mexico. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas.
The Germans are offering to fund a Mexican invasion of the United States that would allow the country to reclaim the border states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas.
The German ploy was preoccupy America with the war with Mexico, and therefore you'd keep them out of Europe. Well, this incensed a lot of Americans, and rightfully so.
The U.S. government releases the contents of the secret message, and almost instantly, anti-German protests erupt all across America.
The Zimmermann telegram was one of the stupidest things the German government ever did. Texas didn't care about the war in Europe. Now, all of a sudden, the Germans are trying to return Texas to Mexico? Enough with Germany. They need to be taught a lesson.
With a profound sense of the solemn and even tragic character of the step I am taking, and of the grave responsibilities which it involves, I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be, in fact, nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States, and that it formally accept the status of belligerency which has thus been thrust upon it.
President Wilson signs the declaration of war in April of 1917. Germany's plan to keep America out of Europe completely backfires. The Americans may finally be ready for war, but their military isn't. The U.S. has a standing army of only 100,000 men, while the German army has 4.5 million. The United States hurries to build its military.
The Selective Service Act of 1917 was the first mass draft of Americans. There had been conscription in various forms before, but even in the Civil War, only 8% of Union troops came from conscription. Whereas selective service made every American man between the ages of 18 and 45 liable to registration. Not all of them were drafted, of course. About 3 million were. That's a significant number. And this represented a big presence for the federal government in Americans' everyday lives as they went to register for the draft, as they carried their draft cards, which were the first identity documents that most Americans had ever carried. Many of them had physical exams or IQ exams. The American population was being measured and counted and accounted for in new ways. The Selective Service Act was also not the most popular act in American history. That although Wilson's declaration of war passed with overwhelming support, the Selective Service Act passed very narrowly, and in fact Woodrow Wilson had to turn to Republicans across the aisle to get the act passed at all. That some of the most bitter opponents of it were some of his former Democratic allies. And on the ground, the Selective Service Act wasn't always popular either. Estimates are that perhaps as many as 300,000 Americans simply dodged the draft by not registering for it or not showing up when the calls came. And there was some opposition to it. There were not the big public demonstrations that we might imagine from where we sit today, but there were sort of individual acts of resistance, some protests along the way.
¿Cuándo deben inscribirse todos los hombres en el servicio selectivo? When must all men register for the selective service? When must all men register for the selective service? A los 18 años. At age 18. At age 18. Entre 18 y 26. Between 18 and 26.
And those few with fighting experience are rushed to France. George S. Patton has been presented with a huge challenge. To command a battalion of American men using the latest form of military innovation. The tank.
Some American generals were really resisting the tank because they didn't want to get rid of the horse cavalry. George Patton understood the power of the new technology of mobile and armored warfare, and he invested a lot in that.
There are a whole range of different emotions. The first is exhilaration, a very personal feeling, exhilaration at being part of an event that is changing the world. And there's never much time to look back. There's always a lot to look forward to.
While most of the world celebrates the end of the fighting, some, deep in the heart of Germany, refuse to accept defeat.
Hitler was wounded in a gas attack at the very end of the war, and he was then hospitalized, temporarily blinded.
There are people who will be losing war against the Western armies.
While he was in hospital, he was then told that Germany had lost the First World War. And that's a crucial turning point in Hitler's life.
In Hitler's worldview, it was always dead or alive. Win or total defeat. For him, surrender was something un-German. You are a coward somehow if you surrender.
Hitler took the surrender personally. A personal, destructive blow to himself. He also took it as a mission in life to avenge and rectify this surrender.
After 4 long and bloody years and 37 million casualties, the United States and the Allies have finally claimed victory, forcing Germany to surrender. But while the fighting has stopped, the pressure is now on the Allied leaders to come to an agreement, preventing war from ever breaking out again. As negotiations to secure the peace get underway in France, massive crowds greet the world leaders, including United States President Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson was the first president of the United States to spend anywhere near 6 months outside this country, and he felt that for him to send anyone else to negotiate the peace, it would not have been as well done. Wilson said, whatever happens with this settlement of this war, if it goes well, give me credit. If it doesn't, blame me.
The leaders gather at the Palace of Versailles, but one country not invited to the table is Germany.
Gentlemen, please sit down. If we can start by considering the points before we discuss any of the individual ideas, or...
The main thing that Woodrow Wilson wanted to accomplish at Versailles was defanging Germany, not allowing them to develop a huge war machine again. This was what the victors all wanted to see happen.
But as negotiations get underway, Wilson quickly realizes that each country has come to the table with their own agenda.
There were these national leaders who had different views of what they wanted out of the Paris Peace Conference. They had led their countries through this brutal, bloody, long war. And Wilson waltzes in with the Americans just at the end. So they had to listen to him. And Wilson could be kind of persuasive, but not that persuasive.
As negotiations drag on for months, the talks fall apart. And one Allied nation feels completely cut out of the negotiations. Japan entered the war in 1914. Contributing thousands of troops and millions of dollars to the war effort. They come to Versailles with one goal: to be treated equally. But Allied leaders completely ignore Japan throughout the proceedings. And for Japan, it's the ultimate insult.
The Japanese, who'd been on the winning side, get this slap at the peace conference. So the Japanese became alienated from the United States and from the Western powers, and it was a fairly straight line from there to the belief that if we're going to get any respect, it's going to be by fighting our way to respect.
The attention shifts from Wilson's plan for a lasting peace to a plan focused on punishing Germany, forcing them to pay for the devastation they've caused.
The reparations that were demanded of Germany were astronomical. It was a matter of, we're going to squeeze as much out of Germany as we can. Well, there was someone on the American side who said, we are making the next war inevitable. Wilson worked against that. Wilson wanted a somewhat more reasonable peace. And he wanted the Germans to feel that they had a stake in the continuation of the Versailles system. The problem with the treaty, as it was finalized, was Germany had no stake in that system and had every interest in overturning the system.
So do our people. That's impossible. When the Germans surrendered, it was on condition that we protect their rights. That's written in the armistice. You yourself signed it.
The Germans forfeited their rights in this war. They are murderers.
Monsieur Clemenceau, I will never be a party to such an agreement. It violates everything we said we were fighting for. To take part of Germany and cede it to France is nothing short of theft.
You live in America, Mr. Wilson, with an ocean on either side. You can afford to be lenient with your enemies.
If you're not prepared to abide by the solemnly accepted terms of the armistice, I might as well go home.
And if such opposition to our just claims is continued, I might as well resign.
You're breaking your word.
I am pro-German.
Gentlemen, let us consider these matters calmly. I'm sure that we all believe in the self-determination clause of the 14 points.
It is not right to do wrong, even to make peace. Besides, the covenant of the League of Nations is sufficient guarantee of France's safety. Under its provisions, there is not the slightest shadow of a doubt but that the United States and Great Britain will instantly rise to the defense of France should Germany ever again become hostile.
That's all very well, Mr. President, when you speak of what America will or will not do. But are you prepared to guarantee what America will do?
I am.
Are you aware that a bloc of 37 senators have signed a resolution stating that the League, as you propose it, is not acceptable to the American people?
I am perfectly aware of that document, monsieur. However, I should like to remind you that these men do not compose the entire Senate, nor do they reflect the opinion of the American people, regardless of party. As a matter of fact, some of the leading members of the Republican Party, including former President William Howard Taft and Charles Evans Hughes, have expressed approval of the League. And I will also give you my word for this too, monsieur. If these 37 men, who represent no opinion but their own, dare try to block, to thwart, to betray the first honest attempt of the world to achieve a permanent peace, the American people will rise in their anger and smash them as they would an alien enemy landing on their shores.
Mr. President, I bow to you. Shall we resume our discussion?
Despite Wilson's best efforts, he is unable to convince the other allies to buy into his plan for peace. After 6 months of intense negotiation, the Allies finally have a treaty. But the final agreement is far from the fair and equitable plan Wilson had originally hoped for.
The losers, Germany principally, they were there. They didn't get to speak. They weren't asked to contribute. They were basically, they had a gun put at their heads, figuratively, almost literally, and said, you're going to sign on the dotted line. It was very much a victor's peace. The victors dictated the terms of the peace. They made out like bandits.
Europe is finally at peace. But while most of the world celebrates, Germany is ordered to pay the Allies over $80 billion, the modern equivalent of nearly $500 billion, a debt they won't pay off until 2010. As a result, the government quickly goes bankrupt, leaving millions of Germans impoverished. The economic devastation completely transforms the country and its people.
Germany immediately is struggling with a question of survival. For ordinary Germans, the war did not end in November 1918. For ordinary Germans, the battle for survival, the daily struggle for food, the effort to find shoes and clothing stretched on into the 1920s.
As the anger and starvation spread, tensions rise throughout the country.
Germany is in a state of near civil war. The left and the right are fighting each other in the streets. Paramilitary groups clash. Germany is a country divided against itself.
When World War I came to an end, this is not a treaty. This is an armistice that'll probably last 20 years. Meaning we have not really defeated the German spirit. We have not really solved this problem.
I've asked you here in the hope that we might come to some understanding about the League of Nations.
I don't mean to be facetious, Mr. President, but whose understanding, yours or ours?
One we can mutually uphold.
In view of our stated positions, I wonder if that isn't expecting a great deal.
Senator, I'm sure we all have one purpose in common: to serve the best interests of the American people.
But apparently we have very different ideas as to what constitutes their best interests.
So tired.
Mr. Tumulty, will you please tell the newspaper men that we're returning to Washington immediately?
Other than winning a Nobel Peace Prize, Woodrow Wilson doesn't really get much out of the 14 points. And it could have been because of his illness, his sickness. He's going to have strokes. And when he goes to the Paris Peace Conference to kind of negotiate with the 14 points with the Allies, he's not feeling really well. And I think that the Allied powers really wrote the Treaty of Versailles. So I think that, number one, you want to realize that most of the 14 points aren't in the Treaty of Versailles. The only one that makes it really is the League of Nations, the 14th point. And then the treaty is kind of filled with language that is very harsh. There's a guilt clause, Article 231, that was interpreted really to put all the blame on Germany. The reparations, even though Germany didn't have to pay fully back what the numbers said, were overwhelming, at least on paper. And I think that the Treaty of Versailles historically is seen as a failure because of these reasons. There's a large gap between the promise of the 14 points, which the Germans knew about, and now this resulting Treaty of Versailles, where the Germans weren't even allowed to be in the room. So basically, the conclusion is going to be that the failure of the 14 points to make it into the Treaty of Versailles is really going to be one of the big reasons for the rise of Nazism, National Socialism in Germany, blaming, not just the Jews, but the Treaty of Versailles on, Germany's woes. And that's going to lead Hitler into the front of the pack eventually. Woodrow Wilson thought he had problems over there on that side of the ocean. When he comes back to the United States, he's got a whole hell of a lot more problems. And that's because of checks and balances in the Constitution. If the president signs a treaty, the Constitution commands that it then goes to the Senate, where it receives a supermajority. That's like not 51%. That's in that instance 67%, 2/3 of the Senate. So that's a humongous number. And I think that this is Woodrow Wilson's downfall. I think his downfall is that he had a stroke when he was trying to sell this thing. I think his downfall is that he was incapacitated and he really shouldn't have been president. We didn't have the 25th Amendment. But his downfall is his lack of negotiations. He's not going to compromise. Henry Cabot Lodge, the famous Republican in the Senate, he was willing to negotiate. The big sticking point was the League of Nations, Article 10, contained a war declaration clause, which would have trumped Congress's ability to declare war. Basically, we would have been chaining ourselves to the League of Nations. So if the League of Nations, the dog of war, wanted to go to war, the United States would have to go with it. And in a sense, we'd be giving up our national sovereignty. PU, that stinks. And Woodrow Wilson wouldn't negotiate. So it's a failure of presidential leadership. It's a failure of foreign policy, because our retreat into isolationism is going to give basically the Germans enough room with appeasement over in Europe to grow into a force that's going to drag us back into World War II.